No shoving there now, shouted the deputy sub-bursar in a fury. He slammed down the lid of his cash box. I shall stop the distribution unless I have good behavior. The deltas muttered, jostled one another a little, and then were still. The threat had been effective. Deprivation of soma. Appealing thought. That's better, said the young man, and reopened his cash box. Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. Mike Boyle at the controls, and our show today is titled Brave New Meaning in the Presence. And what I am doing is forming a bit of a mashup of three different components, 2 books and an obituary. The books would be Brave New World from Aldous Huxley and Man's Search for Meaning from Viktor... Oh, this is great. From Viktor Frankl. How could I ever forget Viktor Frankl? And then the obituary would be from Thich Nhat Hanh. But before I move on to the mashup and the basic components of the show, I'd like to tell you a story. Something I had not thought about in a long, long time. But in preparation for the show, it just came back. There was an acquaintance of mine, this had to have been university times, a long, long time ago. And he told me a story once about his experience going camping. And you have to remember, of course, we had no such thing as mobiles. He did not bring a radio. He did not bring anything apart from what was absolutely necessary for that camping experience. And he was obviously gone for at least 1 week, because the story he told me was covering the duration of 1 week. Within the constant occupation of having something playing in the background, primarily music, the distraction became a vehicle to hold back the ennui. But of course, on this camping experience, he did not have that with him. And that was very unsettling. So he would go back into his memory banks and think of songs that he really enjoyed. And these songs would be playing in his mind because there was a clear need to cover the silence of not having anything with him. As the week progressed, that activity became more and more difficult. I guess his backlog only covered so many songs. And by the end of that week, he was telling me he had commercial jingles that would be going through his mind. As if those commercial jingles were his last gasp of holding on to the weapon that was shielding him from the ennui. But eventually, after 1 week, he succumbed to the pressure of the silence. And there were no more songs to be played. I felt that story was quite appropriate in going through the material for the show today. And I can't even tell you how I came up with the idea. It was through some chatting with a friend of mine, and all of a sudden I had my eureka moment. But in preparation for the show today, I went through both books and realized that they had a lot more in common than I originally thought. Let's start with Brave New World from Aldous Huxley. The book was written in 1931, and it's important to remember what was taking place in the world in 1931. The Great Depression was in full force on both sides of the Atlantic. And it was causing all kinds of havoc, political havoc. It was the year here in Austria where the Kreditanstalt actually failed. And we were getting closer and closer to the civil war that eventually took place in 1934. But certainly Austria was not unique. But 1931 is only a bookmark in a much longer narrative, especially looking at what Huxley wrote about in Brave New World. We were looking to define perfection. We, as human beings, we felt we had the power as human beings to manage nature to that extent that we would have the last word. And if you were to look at the 30 some odd years prior in the effect that The Origin of the Species from Charles Darwin, which was written in 1858, I believe, what kind of effect that had on our society, and especially the movement which is called eugenics, where our focus was on individuals who were born with certain traits that they couldn't do anything about it, the inferiority of such individuals, the justification that was used to persecute certain races, certain ethnic groups, let alone the invalid and the disabled, because, of course, they were born this way, or so we thought. This was the stage that Huxley had to write this book, and you find within the book quite a few references to eugenics, whereas I don't remember the actual word being used. But Huxley describes a world after Ford, Henry Ford, who seemed to be a sense of inspiration for a number of individuals. And this world that Huxley describes is truly eugenics on steroids, where the thought police was ever present. And the idea of being a critical thinker was anathema within the society. There was no struggle. Everyone was happy. The happiness was tied to being with each other, meaning that nobody was lonely. And if indeed you were to have a relapse, there was a drug that was handed out quite freely, which was called soma. And I alluded to the term soma in the beginning of the show. And it was the master drug that you would take, and depending upon how far you were from the happiness, you would take a certain amount of soma and you would partake in a soma holiday. So there were a number of individuals at this time that felt within this world that they were confronted with in 1931, before that, and certainly beyond, that we had the power to create something much better. And there was no conflict. There was breeding taking place in a test tube. And depending upon the types of workers that were required in this new nirvana, that central casting was responsible for defining the intelligence level to make sure that nobody was either too bored or overwhelmed with the task that they needed to perform. And this was all considered to be part of this ideal world. So the state controls the environment for all. And the only real expectation that the state had of its citizens was acquiescence. In other words, they were to agree with the plan. 90 years ago, this book was written and was actually published 90 years ago in 1932. So does everything truly work out ideal in an ideal world? Well, of course, you're going to have those recalcitrants, aren't you? Those individuals who cannot help themselves. Those individuals who come to the conclusion that there is always trouble in paradise. Those individuals who perhaps don't necessarily always believe what they are told. They refuse to ignore the inconsistencies. And there are natural emotions that would come to the forefront, that for them it was important to acknowledge them. So what did the state do with these outsiders? Well, they were banned to islands. They were banned for their antisocial activity. There were a number of islands that were named exotic even today. But I thought the most notable, the one that was considered to be the most far-flung, was the Falkland Islands. And yes, Las Malvinas was 40 years ago. Now, of course, Huxley was showing the dangers that are tied to totalitarianism. We need to remember the extreme viewpoints that we had on both the left and the right at that time were very much focused on central control. Either Stalinist Soviet Union, Mussolini had already been in power for 11 years. And for desperate people, they were seen as being viable solutions. But of course, within the scenery that Huxley described, his objective was to show the absurdity of this concept of such an ideal state. That in fact, Huxley went into great detail to depict the meaning to be found within pain, the meaning to be found within struggle, the meaning to be found within conflict. Knowing full well that we need these components so that we can have a sense of autonomy and mastery. Because, of course, autonomy was the antithesis of this world that Huxley described. And within the concept of mastery, we know that the only way for us to achieve mastery is to try a number of different things that very often do not work. And of course, the frustration that's tied to us, to continuously being confronted with the failure of not getting it right. But of course, all of these elements were missing in this brave new world. And by going through this book again, although I'm sure that Huxley did not realize, and certainly he did not describe it as such, but he was very often talking about the acceptance of now, accepting things as they are, understanding that pleasure alone does not necessarily lead to fulfillment. And within this backdrop that Huxley describes, one has the feeling that there was a world that was completely devoid of meaning. And within the antithesis of the brave new world, he depicts a reservation of Native American reservation in New Mexico. And of course, the juxtaposition of man versus nature couldn't have been any stronger. And if we look at this path that we've been following, going back to Descartes, going into overdrive within the confines of the Industrial Revolution, the thoughts that were tied to concepts like eugenics, which of course have not left us, but they're all tied to one component or one driver, and that is man's mastery over nature. And Huxley describes that quite well in this book. And in fact, he shows the inability for us to actually live in a natural environment because it's no longer part of our experience. We divorce ourselves of that link. And if we look at our situation today, yours truly is no exception. One has to raise the question of how much effort would actually be required to build that link in a proper fashion. That being humanity, being officially part of nature, and that we get off our high horse of trying to control those things that we cannot control. living in the splendor of the moment and understanding that there is a natural order that we should just submit to. So as I mentioned, this journey that I started in putting together these thoughts were all tied to a mashup of Brave New World and Man's Search for Meaning. Ergo, Brave New Meaning. And in fact, the book Man's Search for Meaning from Viktor Frankl is a bit of a mashup itself, because the first part he talks about his experience within a concentration camp, and he was within the book it was mentioned that he was in 4, although his description only really covers 2, that being Auschwitz and Dachau. But he wrote this book in a fever's pace, perhaps in the fever itself, in 1946. And interestingly enough, in comparison of the 2 books, a certain commonality was quite clear, and that was the whole idea of apathy. Apathy as being a vehicle by which we survive. Apathy being a technique that we use to control. And apathy as being the result, after following the path of performing depersonalization. And if there's anything that is quite clear over the events of the last 2 years, in missing that social element, and this is directly tied to the loneliness that has become a major affliction, one that we will hear quite a bit of for a long time to come. Following the adage, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody noticed, does it really matter? Well, there are a number of individuals within our society today who are thinking that because they are not being noticed, that they feel like that tree in the forest, and raise the question, does it even matter? And I would never go to the point of making the accusation that anything along those lines are being managed in a deliberate fashion. But it's quite clear that within that tension that we find today, the polar opposite of apathy is rage. So the components that are required to set that perfect calamity is already among our midst. Frankl, within this book, concentrates on the concept of existentialism. What is the personification of those external elements that hold a certain meaning for us? And in fact, it's part and parcel of our search for meaning per se. And he compares his theory that logotherapy, which he actually created prior to the Second World War, he offers this Gestalt as being an option to the two prevailing methods that were to be found within the realm of psychology at that time. One being the association of status or power or achievement, and the other was tied to our obsession with pleasure, which obviously is the one that Huxley focused on the most within his book. And Frankl goes into great detail to describe the mental state that he was going through and the others that he was dealing with within those years in the concentration camp. And I felt it was quite revealing, without using the terms situational and dispositional. He refers to people who would fall into one camp or the other, regardless of whatever their title would be. A couple of examples. Frankl mentions that the most vicious guards were the ones that were recruited from the prisoners. Because this gave them an opportunity to obtain status, one that they most likely did not have prior to the experience within the concentration camp. And he goes out of his way, Frankl goes out of his way to describe those guards that in spite of the situation, in spite of their position, in spite of the repercussions that could take place in being too much of a human being, they couldn't help themselves. And they always found ways to show that compassion. In the ways that Frankl describes it would be considered perhaps even trite or immaterial. But of course, within a world where the gravity of the situation makes everything so poignant that the random act of human kindness is louder than a bomb. And he goes out of his way, Frankl goes out of his way to describe not only what those individuals would do, but what it meant to him. The beauty of nature became so pronounced for those individuals that regardless of whether they were hungry or tired, if there was some beauty in nature that they can relish, either being a sunset or a sunrise, flora or fauna, they relish those experiences and put them into their memory banks. And in those moments of despair, they would pull out those feelings as a friendly reminder that there's something else out there. And the sense of now is what we make of it. And they talked a lot about food. And they would share recipes to each other. Again, allowing themselves to create their own now. And one would think, especially due to the massive suffering that was taking place, that Frankl, just like Huxley, found that suffering is a necessary component of life. And tension is the driver. He goes on to describe, after the liberation, the struggles that a number of individuals had, apart from simply digesting what had taken place during that time. But there was very often a feeling of not being worthy. And those thoughts that went through their head were very much tied to the anti-victim, or maybe the victimhood was that you were lucky. How come I survived and the others didn't? What did I do to deserve that pleasure now? Can I actually envision myself enjoying, thriving, being part of the world after that of what I experienced? And for me, the biggest moral, this concept of meaning that Frankl talks about, always comes down to a simple fact, in that we all have a choice. We might not necessarily like the choice. And if we refuse to exercise that right, that indeed was a choice itself. So if we spend time assuming because something in the past did not work out well, and it could have even been yesterday, the anger you might have had from a conversation or a situation that took place where you felt that it was not quite fair, and perhaps you might have felt that you were unprepared. We make the choice to carry that one on to today. So the real freedom is leaving that of what took place yesterday, just leaving it there. And absorbing all the sensations which are to be found within the here and now. So for me, in some strange way, with completely different stages that were described in both the books, felt both authors did talk about the power of now. And part of it is the ability to let the ego go and to relish within the splendor of that of what we actually have around us right now. And both authors went into great detail to describe within those adverse situations how that splendor would manifest, and how the meaning was actually to be found within that splendor, the surrender of the ego, which of course is a great segue to the obituary that I stumbled across from an individual that I had no idea about. Thich Nhat Hanh was born in Vietnam. He was considered to be the father of engaged Buddhism. Meaning, instead of looking at the activities to be found within Buddhism from a very passive perspective, that passivity is to be used as a lever to highlight one's engagement. And it was quite interesting going through the description of this most remarkable human being who appears to have been personally responsible in convincing Martin Luther King of the folly which was to be found within the Vietnam War, and eventually led to King's denouncement, which took place in 1966. And of course, that was not easy for MLK, considering that he got all kinds of pushback from the politicians who felt that basically King slapped them in the face. And Thich Nhat Hanh went to the United States and was not let back into Vietnam. And he had the problem also re-entering the United States at one time. So this father of engaged Buddhism led most of his life as a refugee. But if you think about the power that was to be found within the concept of peaceful resistance, which was the basis of his concept of engaged Buddhism, that it was truly massive. And, of course, the price that he paid was being a nomad. Within this obituary that I stumbled across, Thich Nhat Hanh talks very explicitly about the power of now. And that was quite funny. He just, within one of his musings, he described the idea of a watch and the idea that we have these numbers on the watch and that we arrange our lives based upon whatever information is to be found within that watch at a certain period of time. And Thich Nhat Hanh makes a suggestion. What if we replaced all of those numbers with the word now? Can you imagine what that watch would look like? As I continuously look at the clock to make sure I don't go into overtime here. That's my price of being in the now, I guess. But this idea of engaged Buddhism or peaceful resistance in the ability to make a statement by doing nothing. Because that's a choice we have. We have the choice to do something, and we have the choice not to do something. But because we always think that doing something is better than doing nothing, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best choice. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's the most effective. So within the confines that we saw throughout the 20th century, going back to Gandhi, looking at the marches taking place in the United States in the 60s, we're looking at the sit-ins at universities, that sometimes the best way for us to stand up for injustice is by sitting down and doing nothing. Very often because we are felt not to hold the rights to just be. That it's not very compliant in that brave new world. But the power of doing nothing and making a statement in that we are doing nothing it's truly powerful. And I would imagine that at least those of you who are listening locally know about what took place on the edges of the city of Vienna, where a peaceful camp was cleared by the police. And here the government said they had no choice. They had no choice. The government claimed that it was the best for all. The government said it was their right and duty. So I would argue, and looking at all the touch points to be found within that of what I've been describing over the last 53 minutes, it's all part of my now, that it is our right and it is our duty regardless of whether we decide to be active participants or not. But it is our obligation to protect the rights of those who are sitting down. Otherwise, we are no better than those individuals which are to be found within the brave new world who were so afraid that they would not be getting their soma that this minor threat was enough to make them docile. And as the deputy subbursar said, "That's better." And he continued with the distribution. Well, that was a hell of a journey today, going through a number of conditions and understanding that there is to be found within those various narratives a certain continuum and although they are describing often worlds that are completely foreign to our own, that there's an uneerie sense of deja vu to be found within all of these narratives.